spend any time on X or on Substack reading the most thought-provoking essays from conservatives, you've probably encountered Richard Hanania. Richard is the author of the book, The Origins of Woke, which explains how civil rights law created the conditions for woke progressives to engage in ideological enforcement in schools and in the workplace. He is extremely critical of woke progressives, and during the pandemic he strongly denounced COVID overreaches like mask mandates and school closures. But Richard also has a lot of strident criticisms for conservatives. He writes that on average right-wing people are not as well informed as left-wing people, and has also authored a recent newsletter piece that I thought this audience would like to hear about. It's titled Why Americans Should Die for Ukraine, challenging prevailing wisdom on the right about the importance of U.S. involvement in that conflict. Richard Hanania joins me now to discuss that and much more, the election, politics, etc. Richard, I read a lot of what you write, and I find myself nodding along in agreement, sometimes vigorous agreement with like most of it, and then I'll read something that I totally disagree with, or even something that like offends me on a visceral level. That's probably a good trait for an intellectual, that I don't just like automatically agree with what you say, or I think it's worth reading even when I don't appreciate it. But you would, I think, concede that you have been lumped under a variety of ideological categories on the right broadly over the last few years. I think I knew you first as a kind of Iraq war critic, non-interventionist. I think that's what you were on Rising the first time to talk about. And then we were like very in sync on COVID stuff. But you're now more of like a liberal internationalist foreign policy person, but you're also libertarian on a lot of regulatory issues. So why don't you describe yourself for viewers who are thinking right now, who is this person and this doesn't make any sense?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Robbie. I am, I'm an independent writer, so I have the luxury of being able to say what I think and write what I want to write about and not be necessarily beholden to any line. And sometimes I can change my mind and I don't have to just explain it. Well, I explain it to my readers, but I don't have to, explain it to some ideological movement or donors or something like that. But basically, if you just want sort of the summary of my politics, I'm a classical libertarian. I used to be, the big substantive change in my politics over the last 3 years or so has been on foreign policy. I've become more sympathetic towards liberal internationalism, less sympathetic towards restraint or isolationism. I haven't gone the full, sort of resistance, MSNBC, State Department line. In some ways, I go beyond them on certain issues on foreign policy. I think Trump's Middle Eastern policy, the Abraham Accords, I think was a huge success. So in some ways, I'm to the right of the foreign policy establishment. In some ways, I'm with them. But other than that, I'm basically a libertarian, classical liberal who's critical of both sides.
So what are your takeaways from the election? We just had with Trump winning massively. I think most reasonable people expected it was going to be close and either was capable of winning, and that is the case, but Trump happened to win by a lot more than many people expected. Republicans winning all over the place on I don't even on issues, on responses, on gut feelings that things are wrong with the economy and immigration and other such issues. Trump is going to have more of a free hand, I think, or he has fewer people in the Republican Party or in the prospective administration that are going to stop what he wants to do, or we don't exactly know what he even wants to do on a variety of subjects. But he has, this time around, surrounded himself with a really unique set of ideological people, with former Democrats like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, but then also Bill Ackman and Elon Musk. Will Elon Musk be the actual president of this country, with Trump just kind of operating as the front man or the spokesperson for the tech right agenda?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways of looking at this Trump victory, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, first of all, I think just we have to sort of, from a historical perspective and sort of from a perspective of historical causation, just acknowledge Trump's unique appeal. I was looking at the results that, the Mark Robinson scandal, and Mark Robinson lost by 10, 15 points because, of course he did. He had this scandal where he was on this pornographic website and talking about all kinds of weird things. Carrie Lake is another kind of person who, lost by a comfortable amount in Arizona. And like, these people, Trump has a lot of the flaws. I mean, he's an election denier like Carrie Lake. He says crazy things, including things that, arguably are bragging about assaulting sexually assaulting women, but it doesn't harm him. So I think there's just like, first of all, we have to have acknowledgement that this is a unique kind of historical figure with a unique appeal. And as for his victory, there's two ways to look at it. So the tech right, this is something that I wrote about last year. It was the emergence of these people in Silicon Valley. I was thinking about Mark Andreessen, lesser extent Elon Musk. I mean, he had bought Twitter at that point. He hadn't gone all in on Trump yet. So you have these influences. And these are generally pro-market, libertarianish people, but at the same time, you have like these leftists like RFK and Tulsi Gabbard, and even Vance, who is lumped in with the tech right, but is also says a lot of stuff that's friendly to economic populism. So one of these sides, there's a kind of tension here. I think that probably I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the classical liberals, libertarians are probably going to get their way because that's where the GOP establishment is. I don't think RFK and Tulsi Gabbard are going to be as influential on policy as, say, Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or somebody like Peter Thiel is going to be. But it's going to be an interesting tension. It's going to be interesting to watch. And then, so that's like the elite level. And then you could look at the level of sort of the mass public. And the story here is the Hispanic vote. I mean, it's a 25-point shift over one election cycle. Democrats went from winning 33 points, according to the NBC exit poll, to winning by 8 points this time. So 25-point shift in one election cycle, with the same candidate on the ballot. This is also sort of remarkable. I wrote an essay the other day about how this sort of discredits both the left and the right in their sort of demographic, determinism. We used to hear a lot about this during the days of the Obama coalition. They told us about the browning of America. This was something liberals, took seriously and were sort of optimistic about. Maybe Republicans could squeeze out one or two more elections, but then we're on a path to a permanent majority. And then Republicans started to believe it, and people like Tucker Carlson, like Ed Coulter, were saying, okay, we have to keep the country white because, as liberals tell us, it's going to be a less white country, so Republicans will never be able to win an election again. And as it turned out, Hispanics are basically, if you could shift people to 25 percentage points in one election cycle, like you would be foolish to be making predictions 20, 30 years down the line, generationally. Also, Trump's success, the other part of the demographic momentum was about the idea that young people in general were moving to the left. And we've seen, a shift in the other direction too. So I think that there's just it's a huge victory for Trump, for the Trump movement, and also like a blow against this demographic determinism, which I think is unhealthy for both sides. It's unhealthy when the left sits there and say, we're going to become less white, therefore we're going to win. And it's unhealthy when conservatives sit there and say, we need to restrict immigration because we're getting replaced. So that's something that makes me optimistic.
We're going to talk a lot more about that coming up next. Back with Richard Hanania, the author of the book, The Origins of Woke, talking about the election and just other stuff. We were talking in the first part of our interview about shifting demographics. This is something I have been talking about for a long time, and I'm wondering if now the Republican Party will finally notice. And it actually has to do with wokeness, because I realized a while ago, and you probably realized this too, that the wokest people, like the people who want to say Latinx and trigger warnings, etc., are, well, first of all, they're disproportionately affluent and highly educated people, and they're the native-born citizenry. They're the people whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower or whatever. So that was my first attempt to disabuse conservatives of the notion that more immigration was going to make the Republican Party unelectable. More immigrants. And this is not going to be true universally, certainly, but especially fleeing socialist country who are Catholic and want to work. This is a demographic we should be absolutely chasing and catering to. And I'm wondering if the Republican Party, this will be the election they realize that, and will it be the election the Democratic Party realizes that, they're going to lose because of immigration on two ways: for not taking the issue of illegal immigration seriously enough, or what, as all the polls show, and because the immigrants themselves don't like the cultural attitudes of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, you're right. And I think another thing too is just we've seen in the last few years, just internationally, if you think Latin Americans are always going to be leftist, I mean, have you looked at Argentina? Have you looked at El Salvador, where Bukele had just decided to lock up all the criminals and has a 90% approval rating or whatever it happens to be? And yes, and sometimes in Latin America you get a Hugo Chavez or a Maduro or a Castro in a non-democratic setting. But I think all of this is just to show you like history is a living thing. It's not like you can just sit there and count up the whites and count up the Hispanics and count up the blacks and in 2040 or 2050 know what America is going to look like. So I think like conservatives and liberals and all people who are into ideas, we should just be fighting the battle of ideas and like maybe one demographic leans one way or the other, but that's not determinative. And it's just like good if our politics, if we just don't think like this.
All right, I wanted to argue with you a little bit about the Ukraine topic. You wrote, that basically, I think I would summarize your piece as we don't, libertarian or classically liberal people, which I absolutely include myself in that category, suffer from an inability to tell like a grand narrative about what should be done, or say like this is the external enemy to fight, internal or external, or you're being screwed, or the things that are bad are because of this specific entity to go after. I mean, I would argue that it's just kind of like the government or government regulation, but it's an amorphous thing. It's not an easily identifiable thing. And so actually having like, but China and Russia are run by actually bad identifiable individuals, and being against them is like a unifying and good thing, which I agree with that sort of philosophically. But then in terms of the policy, like, I don't know, man. I see a lot of parallels to Iraq and all of and Libya and all the misadventures in the Middle East. Sending weapons to some other country that's going to get slowly being taken over or conquered by bad people anyway, then they end up with all those weapons. Is that a good use of our money? Certainly, if Ukraine wants to resist the country invading them, I say more power to them. They were invaded unjustly by an evil government. But I also want to be like realistic, and I don't think they can defeat Russia, and I would rather have everybody stop dying. And if Trump, who sounds like he wants to convince them to make peace, and wouldn't that be a better thing?
Yeah, I mean the piece, the title was a little bit tongue in cheek, and I like to do this because I want people to read the article. I want to get their attention, but then I want them to read the
Yeah, I've
article, and
noticed
then
that
if
from
they
all your articles
misunderstand it, I'm gonna
about
say, hey, you
how
did.
attractive Sydney Sweeney is. I've gotten that.
Well, that one, the title and the article were both into it. That one wasn't tongue in cheek, but yeah, on this one, I mean, what you're saying a lot of reasonable things. I think the libertarian problem is, yeah, you could say the government. People need meaning. People sort of need an enemy. They need a narrative, and you could say government, but government is often just us. So, like, if you look at something like housing, like why is it so hard to build? People are just NIMBYs. I mean, it's just your neighbor down the street is worried about his home value, and that's really hard to make into an enemy. And you don't want to make that person into an enemy, right? Something like out of control government spending. It's often on entitlements, things people want, and so that's sort of the core of it. Is like you sort of need this for human nature, and like if you. And this is like you could see the left as sort of wokeness, you could see the right as just like conspiracy theories, just looking for the deep state, looking for something that they can hold on to. And if we're going to hate somebody, I say Putin and Xi Jinping are good candidates. Now, you say this sounds like the kind of thinking that led us into Iraq, and I think you're right to be hesitant here. And I think that the problem with Iraq, and I think that we've sort of learned perhaps the wrong lesson. I think we've learned that like we should just not. A lot of people have taken it as we should not be involved in the world. I think the lesson is you should not be sending ground troops to fundamentally remake societies. And I think Libya was similar in that Libya had. I mean, it was just like we're going to overthrow Gaddafi, and there wasn't even like a theory of who was going to replace him. You have to be very, very careful. And American soldiers are not good at this kind of nation building, this kind of social engineering. What we were doing in Iraq and what we were doing in Afghanistan, these were not realistic missions. Now, something like Ukraine, I know people who are opposed to to Ukraine will say we don't want World War III. We don't want our American kids, going dying for Ukraine. That's not happening. That's not on the table. what Ukraine wants is money, and what Ukraine wants is arms, and they have a just cause. And I think that you're right. There is a kind of there is reason to be skeptical that they can actually defeat Russia. I mean, I think maybe there is a role for us to perhaps nudge them in the direction of a peace settlement. But I think whatever that looks like in the end, you could either have a strong Ukraine or you could have a weak Ukraine. And a Ukraine that has more money and more weapons is always going to be in a better position to negotiate. I think a lot of people on the right, particularly, just sort of want to cut off Ukraine, and that's the way you end the war. I don't think that's a moral or a just outcome, and I don't think that's good for us, sort of, just sort of psychologically, and for the national spirit and for what we stand for in the world. Because I don't think it's. I think this is something that realists and restrainers get wrong. Like, a nation sort of has to have a purpose, and you can take it too far. You could end up, 20 years of nation building in Afghanistan, and that could be a mistake. But just to say we're going to hunker down and we couldn't care less what happens, Putin wants to take over half of Ukraine and put everybody who speaks out against him into camps, and we're just fine with that. I don't think that that's good for us either.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want Ukraine to just fall overnight and suddenly become a part of Russia, and have people in Kiev who don't want to live under Putin's regime being forced to do that. I mean, I think if this is as important a national security objective or a European security objective, then their neighbors, the European countries, should primarily be the ones spending more money to send weapons and take care. If it's that important, they should be a little bit more exercised than us, across the sea. But at the same time, if it's just about, well, if the easternmost provinces of Ukraine, which have changed hands, like, I certainly can't take the position that people never have the right to disassociate from one nation if they feel more cultural kinship with another, as some of the people in the borders and those territories do with Russia. It ends up being a little bit more complicated. Yes, I don't think the entire country. I mean, I don't think anyone should live under a regime they don't want to live under. But I can't say that this border, which has only existed for so long, is the only construction for this group of ethnic different identities who didn't necessarily perceive themselves as all the same people going back historically, and that we across the sea should spend a significant amount of military resources trying to preserve that status quo, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that the problem is that once you open the door to redrawing borders, and this is the what Woodrow Wilson and we discovered after World War I, you open up a can of worms, and you don't want to be there because every border could potentially be subject to revision. So just a hard and fast rule that says the borders today, we're sticking by them, and deal with it, learn to live with people, I think is a good rule, because otherwise you sort of have this endless conflict. Now, in extreme situations like Sudan, where South Sudan was being slaughtered, they were being there's a genocide going on. Sure, something like that, maybe you can support a secessionist movement. But I think that the idea that I don't think the treatment of Russians in eastern Ukraine was that extreme. I don't think they would have I don't think they would have risen up and been able to break off without Russian support and Russian leadership to a large extent. I mean, people talk about how in 2014, there was a little more support for Russia in the eastern provinces. In 2022, they really didn't find that much and just had to rely on brute force. I don't think this is the kind of behavior we can accept. I mean, we might have to accept it as a matter of realism. Russia is just a lot bigger and more powerful than Ukraine, and it just means more to them. But yeah, I don't think we should grant moral legitimacy to that claim, except again in the most extreme circumstances.
Let's go back to U.S. politics to wrap this up. You're describing yourself as a classical libertarian of some sort. I think of myself that as well. I actually voted for the Libertarian Party's candidate, even though increasingly members of the top leadership of the Libertarian Party went all in for Trump and urged people who feel that way to do that. Trump himself has moved, as we discussed a little bit earlier. The party under Trump, the Republican Party, has in some ways moved in a less libertarian direction on trade, on tariffs. There actually isn't the Democratic Party is maybe better on free trade. There's neither of the major parties are where I would want them to be on these issues. But there's been a slightly different foreign policy, and then maybe in terms of the running of the government and the internal regulations, how much the IRS is going to harass you, how much the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is going to harass your small business. On that, he's probably just as much, or where any other Republican was on having a limited or restrained government view. I think those issues, it goes to what you're saying about libertarianism having a hard time finding an enemy to identify. It like is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on some level. You talk to small business owners throughout the country who really don't care who the president is or don't even want to care who the president is, but know that under democratic governance, you just have more bureaucrats looking through your books, harassing you, making business more difficult for you, costs you must then pass on to your consumer, and under Republicans, you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think my case for Trump is, look, I believe in economic freedom. I think it's the most important thing, and I think it's the best thing for society. And Republicans just sort of as a knee-jerk thing, not because they're all necessarily reading Adam Smith and or Frederick Hayek. I mean, I think there's, often in history, it's sort of people support good things for the wrong reasons. A lot of them are just, conspiracy theorists to think the government is out to get them. But they happen to
Well,
come
sometimes
down
we're right when
on
we
the,
think the government is out to get us, right?
and so, yeah, it depends on sort of how you formulate that statement, sure. But yeah, I mean, but another thing that you're getting at is sort of this anti-trade, kind of, and there's this sort of economic populism that Trump sounds, sympathetic to, and Vance sounds sympathetic to. I think I go by the first administration, and for the most part, I mean, they didn't do that stuff. I actually created a betting market on the degree to which Trump will have a major tariff. So it was conditional. If Trump wins, will the total tariffs reach like 6% on weighted goods? And there's a way to calculate that. And I took the side of no, because I wanted to publicly say, like, I think tariffs will go up a little bit, like they did in the first administration. But if we, from what we can measure, I don't think we're going to get extreme. So he promised a 10% tariff. I put the number at 6%, that we would not get, up to 6%. It's about 3-4% now. But it's if you take the economic nationalism seriously enough, if I thought that like the worst statements of Trump and Vance on the economy were going to become law, I would probably vote for Harris or like restrain from voting. I don't believe that from the first administration. I don't believe that based on sort of the power centers within the Republican Party, based on where most senators and most members of Congress are at. On immigration and trade, yes, because there's a general sort of, sort of anti-foreigner thing going on that, there's kind of a demagoguery on the right. But in general, I think Republicans are better for economic growth. I think we've seen that at the state level. I have an analysis of 40 years of basically economic freedom being correlated with growing population and faster GDP growth. And so, yes, I mean, I think we're at the point where the reasonable position is like Republicans are still better at the economy, but there's a lot of sort of trends and intellectual currents on the right that are worth worrying about and thinking about how to counteract.
Richard Hanania, thank you so much for joining me today. This was very enjoyable.
Thank you, Robbie.